Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading Chapter 6 of F.I.S.T, but first a quick recap. In the previous chapter, Johnny starts his job at Fleckner Brothers' warehouse thanks to Abe's help. We are reintroduced to the warehouse boss Gant and his cruelty almost immediately, as his disdain for immigrants and workers in general is made abundantly clear. Afterwards, Johnny meets some of his fellow workers, Al Dorset and Lincoln Dombrowski. Johnny manages to hang on to this job despite the poor conditions and the constant buzzing in his head from Gant's buzzer. At Christmas, the owner of the company, Mr. Fleckner, gives each of the men $20 as a bonus, and almost immediately afterwards, each man is called up by Gant to give him half of that bonus. When two men are fired without cause 2 days before Christmas, Johnny begins to think about what they can do to affect change at the warehouse. Abe thinks that Johnny is talking crazy and is only trying to get back at Gant. The other men just laugh and don't take him seriously. To them it isn't worth the risk, at least for now. And now, F.I.S.T, Chapter 6. Abe stood by and watched as Johnny kept after the men. He wasn't surprised. Johnny was like that. When he got something into his head, come hell or high water, it was like he wanted to prove that he could do it, that he could convince them, that Abe was wrong, that the men had more guts than Abe did. He cornered all the guys and gave them his pitch. "How can you guys take that shit?" Johnny said. "Why should we beat our brains out like fucking slaves? He took the dough we got for Christmas. We gotta do something about it. We gotta." They said, "What, Johnny?" Johnny told them. That ended it. "Things are bad, yeah," Dorset said. "Not that bad. Not to pull something like that." "You know where I was before I got this job?" Abruzzi said. "Down by the lake. There's a big sand pile down there. You ever been down there, Johnny? You walk down in the summer, you can see the stovepipes sticking out of the ground. People are living in that sand pile. I was living in it. I don't want to live there no more." "I got me a brother I'm taking care of, Johnny," Faflick said. 6 months ago, he was driving a delivery truck in Detroit. He had a house and a car. He was happy. The kind of guy that's always telling you a joke. A good joke, too. Then he got laid off. He tried to get something every day after that. He couldn't. You look in his eyes now. There's nothing there. They're dead. Big, blue, dead eyes. They say he's had a mind breakdown. Somebody's got to pay the doctor. They all had their reasons, Abe saw. Good reasons, too. He was glad he wasn't helping Johnny. It was Johnny's crazy bullheadedness, his hatred for Gant, his pride, that was driving him. It was a personal battle between Johnny and Gant, and Abe wondered whether he was just using the men to get rid of Gant, to win the fight. Johnny kept at it with the men. He badgered them over and over again, with his eyes, the sarcastic look on his face. "You don't have any guts," Johnny was saying. The men listened to it and, Abe saw, some of them were getting upset. It was a shit job, all of them knew it. They didn't need to get their faces rubbed into the shit. Some of them started grumbling about Johnny behind his back. Dorset cooled them down. "He's all right," Dorset said. "He's a young, fiery kid. When I was his age, I was just like him. He reminds me of me." "Can't you talk to him, Abe?" Dombrowski said. "Somebody's got to talk to him." Abe tried. He stopped him on the sidewalk one night after work. "You want to go down to Ziggy's for a beer?" Johnny shook his head. "You want to come up to my room?" "What for?" "What do you mean, what for, Johnny? I got to give you a reason? I want to talk to you." "Yeah, well," Johnny said, "I got nothing to say." "Lay off of this, goddammit. You're making a lot of enemies out of guys that like you." "You're a real big help to me, Abe," Johnny said. "You know that? Thanks a lot." "Don't you understand, Johnny? Jesus Christ. It wouldn't do any good. It's crazy. They'd just can all of us." "Not if we get Fleckner down here," Johnny said. "The hell with Fleckner. Fleckner is Gant. Don't you see that? He's worse than Gant." "How the hell's he worse than Gant?" Johnny said. "You tell me that." "'Cause at least Gant's straight. We know how he feels about us. He don't hide nothing. Fleckner feels the same way, I'm telling you. He just goes through a show." "You don't really know that, do you, Abe?" "Johnny, every goddamn company in this goddamn country is the same goddamn way. Open your eyes. You're the one that can't see straight. You're up to your fucking eyeballs in that garbage Sabo says all the time. You don't want to help me, Abe? Don't help me. I don't need you to help me. Why don't you go home and get one of your fancy books? Why don't you get the fucking Communist Party manifesto, Abe? And why don't you stick your dick into it and jack off? The next day at the warehouse, Ned Sweeney got canned and Abe was almost ready to help Johnny then. Ned had come in 20 minutes late. Gant hit the buzzer as soon as he saw him. The men watched. Gant said, "All right, Sweeney, you're through." "Mr. Gant," Sweeney said. "I'm sorry I'm a little late, Mr. Gant. My boy's sick." Sweeney kept talking, but they couldn't hear him because Gant kept hitting the buzzer. He hit it 4 times. It was the signal for the guard, who came in and led Ned Sweeney away. At lunch that day, the men were silent and subdued. Johnny sat there looking at them. He didn't say a word, but Abe knew the men heard what he was saying. Johnny was saying it so loud that it hurt. Then he got up and looked at them. "Well, that's it for Sweeney," Johnny said. "Who's it going to be next week? You or Bruzy? How about you, Link?" He grinned and walked away. "Maybe he's right," Abruzzi said. "No, he ain't," Link said. When Abe got to work a few mornings later, he knew it would be a bad day. Only 7 o'clock and the booze was already coming off of Gant. It looked like it would be Dombrowski's turn that day. Gant kept after him, hitting his buzzer, calling him Pollock as if he were saying the N-word. As Link was eating lunch, Gant hit the buzzer again. "Pollock, get up here! Stack those crates, proper, right now!" Gant was getting off the platform all day to go to the John. By mid-afternoon, there was a cloud of whiskey around him. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they got a delivery of peaches in a boxcar. They started lugging them inside. Gant came out to the loading dock and started screaming at Link. "You think I can't see you, you lazy bastard?" "I didn't do nothing, Mr. Gant." "Take 3 more of these crates." Gant picked the crates up and piled them onto Link's arms. "Now get in there." As the men were watching them, Link had 6 crates in his arms, too heavy a load for one man. His body strained. He was off balance as he walked inside. Then Gant shoved him and the crates fell. Peaches splattered and rolled all over the warehouse floor. "That's 3 crates of peaches, Pollock," Gant said. "Company says—" "You put 'em on there, Mr. Gant," Link said. "I didn't." "You break 'em, you pay for 'em." Link shook his head. He kept his eyes on the ground. "You hear me, Pollock?" "I heard you." "Then get down there and pick 'em up." Gant walked away toward the platform. Link stood there a moment, then hunkered down and crawled on the ground after the peaches. The men stood there staring at him, too stunned to move. Suddenly Johnny was down there on the ground with Link, helping him pick up the peaches. "You guys just gonna stand there?" Johnny said. The men got down on the floor to help them. Gant saw them and hit the buzzer. "What are you doing? Get back to work!" The men stayed there and pretended they didn't hear him. Gant hit the buzzer. He hit it again and again. "Get to work, all of you!" he screamed. The men ignored him. Then, suddenly, Gant was on top of them, off his platform, standing right above them, screaming. "Didn't you hear me?" The men backed away slowly until only Dombrowski and Dorset were left on the floor. "Dorset," Gant said, "you're fired." "What?" "You're through." "I didn't hear you, Mr. Gant," Dorset said. "I got hurt in the war." Gant walked away toward his platform again. "It's true," Dorset said. "I can't hear good." The men stood there looking at him. Link was still on the ground, motionless, staring at the cement. Dorset walked slowly after Gant and stood in front of his platform. "It's true," he said. "Please, I didn't hear you." Gant laughed. "Go get a hearing aid," he said. Then, suddenly, as the men watched in shock and disbelief, Dorset was up on the platform. He had Gant by the throat. There was a funny sound coming from him, a scream and a moan. Gant's finger was on the buzzer. The guard came rushing in, the billy in his hand. He swung it at Dorset's head. The men heard the thunk. They heard it again and again. The guard kept clubbing him. Blood was gushing from Dorset's ear. Dorset fell off of the platform and onto the cement. The men stood there, ashamed that none of them had helped him. In a dank and airless corridor outside the hospital emergency room, Abe sat on the floor with the men, his head in his hands. "Come on, Dorset," he said to himself. "You can make it. You can. You've got to." And then he thought, we just stood there. All of us. We didn't help him. We let the guard hit him. Why? Why? Are we men? Am I? After what seemed like a very long time, a doctor was walking out of the emergency room toward them. "He has a concussion," the doctor said flatly. "Not too bad. He should be all right." Abruzzi laughed. "God bless you." "Can we go see him?" Link asked. "See him?" the doctor said. "Absolutely not." "How come?" Johnny said. "The police are moving him now." "Police?" Link said. Johnny looked at the doctor. "Moving him where?" "The prison ward. He's been arrested for assault." "Assault," Johnny said. He laughed. The laugh was bitter and choked. "You'll have to move from here," the doctor said, looking at him. "We always keep this corridor open." They looked at each other, got up from the floor, and walked down the corridor to the door. There was a police car outside. Dombrowski looked at it. "Fuck it," he said. "Fuck it. I don't care." At 8 o'clock that night, the 22nd day of February 1935, the temperature in Cleveland was 19 degrees. A howling 30-mile-an-hour wind whipped the snow, which had been falling for 2 days, into 3-foot drifts. Most Clevelanders were inside, trying to stay warm, listening to Eddie Cantor's Camel Caravan or the voice of Firestone, or Phil Spitalny's all-girl orchestra. Radio station WTAM interrupted its programming to say that 3 more inches of snow were expected that night. "Leapin' lizards, it's cold out there," the announcer laughed. On West 25th Street, on the near west side of the city, Mike Monahan sat at the wheel of his half-ton Chevrolet truck and felt every one of his 54 years. He was freezing. His heater didn't work. For 3 weeks now, he had been after his supervisor at the Consolidated Terminal to fix it. The supervisor still hadn't done it. He probably wouldn't do it until the spring, and Mike Monahan knew well the reason why. They wanted him to quit. They didn't have any cause to fire him except for the fact that he headed up Local 302, but they didn't want to fire him for that. They knew the other drivers liked him. They knew, too, that times were changing. FDR was a friend to the working man, as much of a friend as it was ever possible for a politician to be. The yellow dog, the contract which forbade a man to join a union, couldn't be enforced anymore. So they wouldn't fire him, but they wouldn't fix his heater either. And, knowing that his heater didn't work, they sent him, on a day as raw as this, for a load of tomatoes 30 miles away, a load which he had to haul back to the city that night in this hellish cold. Mike Monahan knew the road by heart. Billboards were his signposts. Buy Iodent toothpaste. Camel cigarettes are the highest quality regardless of price. And there she was now, good old Kate. Kate Smith says buy borax. Tonight, Kate Smith was the best friend a man could possibly have, even if she did weigh more than Mike Monahan's truck. Kate Smith meant that in another 15 or 20 minutes, he would be at the Fleckner warehouse and this long and brutal day would be over. And he could go home once again to his empty house, and he could soak his aching joints in a hot bath. Swirling snow blew across the road ahead of him. The big truck shuddered in the wind. Inside the Fleckner warehouse, as Mike Monahan drove toward them, the men were huddled in groups against the wall. Gant sat on his platform, a newspaper in front of him. "Gehrig," Abruzzi said, glancing at Gant. "It's Gehrig that makes him work. Ruth, he's a show-off. For my money, I'll take Gehrig any day." "What money?" somebody laughed. "Baloney," Fawflick said. "He's a line drive hitter. A line drive hitter, that's all. He don't win the games." "How long?" Dombrowski asked nervously. "Any time," Abe said. "He ought to be here any minute now." "I wish he'd hurry," Dombrowski said. The others looked at him. Abruzzi said, "What do you mean he don't win the games? He gets on base, don't he? You gotta get on base to get the runs." "I don't know," Johnny said. "You can't beat the long ball." "How could you beat a guy? He points to the fence, and there the son of a bitch goes, huh? The size of that guy's balls." Luck, Abruzzi said. That's all. Faflik said, I'll take that kind of luck any day. Dombrowski looked at Gant. He got up and started to pace. Ain't he gonna get a surprise, he said. Link, Johnny said. Sit down. Relax. Yeah, Link, Abe grinned. Tell us what you think. I think I'm scared, Dombrowski said. About Gehrig and Ruth? Johnny grinned. He looked at Abe. That's what the subject of this here get-together is, ain't it? Dombrowski shook his head, sat down, and didn't say anything. What's the matter, Link? Abe smiled. Don't you like baseball? Did you hear the one about the pigeons in the park? Somebody said. Things are so bad, it ain't the people feeding the pigeons no more, it's the pigeons feeding the people. It wasn't very funny, but they roared. Gant glanced at them. They heard the truck honk at the gate and they stopped laughing. At the gate, the guard came out of his truck. Consolidated, Monahan said. Tomatoes. What took you so long? The guard grinned. Did you knock off a piece on the way up? Just get the damn gate, will you? Monahan said. You don't have to drive 5 hours in this shit. When Mike Monahan got out of his truck at the loading dock, Gant was already standing there. You want to check 'em? Monahan said. Goddamn right I'll check 'em. I didn't need any of 'em, Monahan said, if that's what you're worried about. We inspect the merchandise, Gant said. You know the rules. The men stood on the loading dock in their coats and jackets, shivering, looking at each other. Gant opened 2 crates of tomatoes, felt them with his hands. All right, he said. Get 'em in there before they freeze. He walked back into the warehouse. Mike Monahan watched them as they started unloading the crates. Something's wrong, he thought. He couldn't put his finger on it. They were moving slowly. They kept looking at each other. They finally started taking the crates out of the truck. But what in the Sam Hill? They were stacking them up on the loading dock. Jesus Christ, Monahan said. You gotta get 'em inside. Inside. They're gonna freeze out here. That's so, Lincoln Dombrowski said. They kept piling the crates up on the dock. What the hell's wrong with you guys? Mike Monahan said. Johnny looked at him. Keep your nose out, Jack, he said. Mike Monahan had had a long day. He didn't need this. It ain't Jack, Jack, he said angrily. Johnny looked at him calmly. It's Jack shit to me, pal. He walked into the warehouse carrying a crate of tomatoes. The men followed him inside, some with crates in their hands. Monahan trailed them. Johnny stopped in front of Gant's platform. The men stood behind him. Gant saw them line up. What the hell are you doing? Get those crates in here! He pushed his buzzer. Johnny handed his crate to Abe and walked up the steps to Gant's platform. Gant stared at him wide-eyed. He looked scared. Except for Dorset, none of the men had ever been up here. Johnny grinned. Excuse me, Mr. Gant, he said. He reached around Gant and yanked the buzzer and its wiring out of the stand. Mike Monahan couldn't believe what he was seeing. Holy shit, he whispered to Dombrowski. You're fired, Gant sputtered. You bastard! I knew you were trouble. You hear me? You're fired! Johnny laughed at him. Kiss my ass, Mr. Gant. The men cheered. Johnny walked off the platform. Has he gone nuts? Monahan whispered to Dombrowski. We've all gone nuts, Dombrowski said. You want a tomato? Mike Monahan looked at him. What? A tomato. Dombrowski was handing him one. Monahan stared at him bug-eyed. No thanks. I don't like them neither, Dombrowski said. Mike Monahan shook his head and walked away from him. The day had gone on too long. These guys were nuts, the whole crew of them. Guard! Guard! Gant screamed. He was jumping up and down on his platform. His face was crimson. He moved his hand toward the buzzer, stopped, and realized it was no longer there. Here, Johnny said. He threw the buzzer up on the platform. The men laughed. The guard came through the door, his club in hand, and headed for the platform. Dombrowski tripped him and kicked the club out of his hands. The guard stayed on the ground and looked around, stunned. Dombrowski picked the club up and tapped it against his palm. The black man smiled down at the guard, still tapping his club. The guard made no move to get up. Gant looked at the guard, at the men in front of him. Get Fleckner down here, Johnny said. I want to talk to him. Mr. Fleckner, Gant said. Mr. Fleckner? You don't talk to Mr. Fleckner. Who the hell do you think you are? He looked away from Johnny to the other men. Get those tomatoes in here, he screamed. You want a tomato, Mr. Gant? Dombrowski said. He tossed a tomato up on the platform. Gant watched as it rolled across the platform and fell to the floor. You're fired! All of you! He yelled. You're out in the gutter! All of you! Johnny smiled and turned to Abe. Give me some of those tomatoes. Abe handed him a crate. Johnny smiled at Gant, raised the crate high above his head, and slammed it to the cement floor. You're destroying my merchandise, Gant yelled. You can't! The words stuck in his throat. Give me another one, Johnny said. He raised another crate high, still smiling, and slammed it to the floor. Another and another. Gant looked pale. I'm gonna keep taking these, Johnny said, and I'm gonna keep smashing 'em till you get Fleckner down here. Gant stood on the platform, breathing loudly, dazed. Johnny smashed another crate to the cement. Maybe he wants to get down on the ground and pick 'em up, Dombrowski smiled. Gant looked down at the black man, fear in his eyes. He rushed down the steps and across the warehouse floor to a telephone. The guard jumped off the floor and tried to catch up with him. Hurry it up, Dombrowski shouted after him. We ain't got all night. The men laughed uneasily. Mike Monahan smiled. Yes, they were all nuts. Yes, it had been a long day, but God damn it, he hadn't enjoyed anything as much in years. An hour and a half later, Johnny, Abe, and Dombrowski, representing the other men, sat in a brightly lighted office on the warehouse's top floor. Across from them sat a middle-aged, impeccably dressed man trying unsuccessfully to light his pipe. Peter Andrews, the business manager of Fleckner Foods. I don't know who the hell you are, Johnny said, looking at him coldly. It's Fleckner we want. I told you who I am, Mr. Kovac, Andrews said. His manner was friendly and understanding. Now look, it's late and it's rather silly to beat around the bush, no? Mr. Fleckner is in Florida, vacationing. I told you that. I'm sorry he can't be here to talk to you, but we didn't exactly have advance notice of your plans, he smiled. Now did we? Johnny didn't say anything. Abe grinned. Well, I guess that part is true. All right, Andrews said. Thank you, Mr. Belkin. Now, let's get down to business, shall we? I don't want these tomatoes out on the dock to freeze, and you don't either. Why not? Johnny said. Because those tomatoes are your trump card, Andrews smiled. Am I not right? Once they freeze, you've lost your leverage, and it's very, very cold out there. Andrews finally lit his pipe. Now, what is it exactly that's upset you so much? Uncomfortable in this brightly lighted room, they told him hesitantly about the things that they felt were unfair. Andrews listened to them solemnly, nodded, and puffed his pipe. When they were finished speaking, he put the pipe down and said, almost gravely, I want to be fair about this. Dombrowski laughed. Here's something new. I'm happy you told me these things, Andrews said. The version I heard of the incident with Mr. Dorset was completely different, and I certainly had no idea of the situation with the Christmas bonuses. The amount of time spent to earn the 8 hours' pay is, I must say, a company decision, a decision of the board of directors. I was aware of that. Let me say this to you. It certainly sounds like you have some legitimate complaints, and perhaps one lesson is that we should set up some program whereby either Mr. Fleckner or I can talk to you men more often. Dombrowski laughed. A drink after work, maybe? He said. Look, Andrews continued. His tone tolerated no levity. Let's agree on this. We'll drop the charges against Mr. Dorset, and we'll permit him to come back to work. As far as Mr. Gant is concerned, I will see to it personally that he returns the money he took from all of you. And from now on, Mr. Gant can't fire anyone without my approval. Mr. Fleckner is a busy man. I don't want to bother him with it, but I'll attend to it. No firings without my approval. How's that? Sounds okay, Johnny said warily. And from now on, when there is an accident and the goods are damaged, you won't be docked from your pay. Dombrowski laughed again. That's a little late for this Pollock, he said. No, Andrews said. We will, of course, return your money for the peaches. How's that? They looked at each other. Abe said, What about being paid for regular hours waiting on deliveries? Andrews paused. As I said, I want to be honest with you. It would be very easy for me to lie and give you everything you want just so you bring the tomatoes inside, but I'm not going to do that. As you'll see, I don't operate that way. I can't tell you that we'll change that policy, Mr. Belkin. It's not up to me. It's up to our board of directors. I will take it up with them, though. I give you my word of honor. I will raise the issue. But I honestly can't do better than that. The decision will be theirs. Johnny and Abe looked at each other. Neither of them said anything. Now, to be fair, Andrews said, will you move those tomatoes inside right away? There was silence in the room. Dombrowski broke it. How do we know you ain't lying? Well, Andrews said, I suppose you don't. But I haven't made any grand promises to you, have I? I haven't agreed to everything you want, and I've been honest with you about that. If I were lying, wouldn't it make sense for me to promise you anything you want just to convince you to bring the tomatoes in here? Maybe, Johnny said. Andrews smiled. Now look, Mr. Kovac, I can see you're a sensible man. Those tomatoes, left out there much longer, will freeze. You don't want them to freeze, do you? It would mean a significant loss to this company. And wouldn't that be a shame? For all of us? Haven't we made some progress in this room, in terms of our relations in the future? No one said anything. How do we know you're going to talk to them about the extra pay? Abe said. Andrew shrugged his shoulders. You have my word. Is that any good? Johnny said. Yes, it is, Andrew said coldly, as you'll see. He knocked the ash from his pipe and pulled a black leather pouch from his pocket. Now, he said slowly, do we agree? Johnny looked at Abe and Dombrowski. He learned nothing from their expressions. We want to go out and talk, he said. Fine, Andrew said, but please don't take too long. Remember those tomatoes and how cold it is out there. Out on the truck dock next to the stack of tomatoes, Johnny talked to the men and told them what took place in the brightly lighted office. Mike Monahan stood among them, listening. But all we got's his word, Dombrowski said. Abe said, that's more'n we had before. How do you know he ain't lying? Dombrowski asked. Johnny dragged on a borrowed cigarette. I don't, he answered. That guy must sleep in his suit, Dombrowski said. How can you trust anybody sleeps in his suit? The men laughed. Abruzzi said, what do you think, Johnny? I'm freezing my ass, Faflik said. Abe, Johnny said finally, what do you think? It ain't good, Abe said. Maybe not as bad as before. Link? I think this Pollock's gonna get lynched, the black man said. That's what I think. The men laughed uneasily, their eyes on Johnny. Come on, Johnny, it's cold out here, Faflik said. Johnny looked at them, tossed the cigarette away, and took a deep breath. What the hell? He said. In the brightly lighted room, Andrew shook Johnny's hand. Excellent, Mr. Kovac, he said. You'll find it will be a good agreement. Now please, those tomatoes. Johnny grinned. Don't worry, we'll get 'em right away. Good. What I'll do right away is have a talk with Mr. Gant. He raised his voice. Guard, let Gant in here. Gant walked into the room. The big man seemed to have shrunk. He avoided their eyes. He was hunched over and looked unsteady on his feet. Johnny grinned at him. Andrews said, and by the way, I want to thank you personally, Mr. Kovac, for bringing all this to my attention. Gant stood there listening to Andrews, his head bowed. As Johnny walked out the door, he heard Gant say, You wanted to see me, sir? And he heard Andrews. Some things, Mr. Gant, we'd better get straight. Johnny laughed in the corridor. Did you hear that, Abe? He said. He grabbed Abe and lifted him into the air, laughing. We won! Jesus fucking Christ! Wait till we tell Dorset. Wait till I tell Ma. We won! Mike Monahan watched him as he hugged Abe and stalked triumphantly down the stairs. Monahan smiled. This hellish day, this freezing cold, the pain in his bones, it had all been worth it. All of it. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of F.I.S.T. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. I hope you're all doing well.